Does the United States have a plan to dominate the world, a grand strategy to dominate the world? Well, yes, but it's not maybe quite the grand strategy that you might think, and it is also not going quite to plan. It appears to be failing and becoming a more and more panicky response. I'm Jeff Rich. This is the Burning Archive, where I talk about world history and geopolitics today and try to frame a lot of the big, distressing events that are happening in the world in a broader historical and cultural context to give you a bit of a longer view and a deeper view on the events of today. And a question a lot of people around the world are asking is, does the United States have a grand strategy guiding its foreign policy under Donald Trump or under any other administration? Now, a lot of people will say the grand strategy is either determined by the deep state or was set out in works like Halford Mackinder's idea of dominating Eurasia to dominate the world, or, of course, the very similar ideas set out by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his book, The Grand Chessboard. Go into the heartland, control Eurasia, control the world. I would say, in some respects, those ideas certainly express ambition, and a quite, I would say, insane ambition to dominate the world. After all, Halford Mackinder made his claim about dominating Eurasia without anyone actually having achieved that. It's a pure statement of his imperial fantasy, is actually not a statement of fact. The idea that people have developed geostrategies based on this imperial fantasy from 1904 is really quite bizarre. Putting that aside, I think another mistake people often make is they assume these grand strategies are more thought out or more planned and articulated than they really are. Sometimes, for example, people like Brian Bolletic will pick out policy papers that do seem to express a plan. But in my experience in government, most strategies are what some people call emergent strategies. They are sort of a somewhat chaotic response to events rather than something that you can write out in a plan. Now, you may well follow some of those steps in the plan, but what you will find is events happen in a different way. Things don't really occur in the fashion that was anticipated, and the plan is a useful guide to intentions, but it doesn't really make intelligible the whole strategy. But I do think there is a grand strategy, if you can call it that, that is intelligible in the US foreign policy state, the US government's action, recognising, of course, that the US is a networked empire all across the world that, brings in the elites of Europe and Israel, Australia, many countries around the world into its global reach. And that strategy has to some extent been articulated by the Russian economist and strategic thinker Sergei Glaziev, who spoke about a 5-step plan of the United States to dominate the world, or a 5-stage plan. And I'd slightly adapt Sergei Glaziev's idea and talk about a 7-stage plan. And let me take you through that 7-stage plan now. The first step, which is not really articulated in Sergei Glaziev's article or comment, but it was in a way assumed by Sergei Glaziev, is of course the eastward expansion of NATO after 1991. The eastward expansion of NATO pushed almost double the territorial size of NATO and brought in Eastern Europe to really fundamentally rebalance the politics, the society, the military strategic thinking of Europe and the collective security of Europe by bringing in the East European states, including, of course, Poland. And a lot of these states also had significant emigre communities in the United States who saw their inclusion of their former homelands in NATO as a way to reach out and increase their influence over their former countries. And the thing about this part of the strategy, it really started to deepen the polarisation between Europe and Russia and started to eliminate the possibility of a genuine partnership that had been sought by the Russian side from the 1980s with the rest of Europe for collective security, and indeed with the United States for broader collective security around the world. So that's stage one, eastward expansion of NATO. Stage two is the first step in Sergei Glavsev's plan, and that is the Maidan events in 2014 and 2013 in Ukraine, the installation of a pro-Western, pro-United States especially, regime in Kiev that would be, as the Russian diplomats refer to it, an anti-Russia dagger pointed at the central, the most populated zone of Russia, across the Eurasian steppe, just a march into Moscow. Now, a significant thing about this was not just a plan against Russia, this was also a conflict with the European Union. The events in 2013 in Ukraine were deeply tied up with the global financial crisis, the wake of that global financial crisis in the Eurozone crisis from after 2008 up to 2013, Greece, Spain, all that sort of stuff. Significant debt in Ukraine itself, and the discussion within Ukraine, the negotiation by Ukraine of either economic arrangement with Russia as part of, the Eurasian Economic Zone, or a economic arrangement with Europe as part of the European Union, part of the European zone. Now, Ukraine, a lot of the support for the Maidan events and the sort of the anti-Russia parties, let's say, just simply in simple terms, in Ukraine, was based on this hope that by joining the European Union, they could have the same level of prosperity as the European Union. But that was always a bit of an illusion. And during the negotiations, the European Union played hardball. And then the US came in, famously, Victoria Nuland came in and said, F the EU. And what was she saying F the EU about? The US did not want Ukraine, the largest country in Europe after Russia, many natural resources and strategic assets, including control of the Black Sea and all that sort of thing. They did not want Ukraine integrated into the European Union, its geopolitical rival, its economic peer, to be honest. It wanted to use Ukraine for its world domination purposes, its geostrategic military intelligence purposes. It wanted to integrate Ukraine into the conflict with Russia. It wanted to integrate Ukraine into NATO to be Europe's army on behalf of the United States against Russia. And so the second stage of the event was important because it also set up this conflict between the European Union and its elites and their direction. Do they support collective security, economic cooperation within Europe, within, a greater concept of Europe, or do they focus on Atlantic security priorities. The Ukraine events helped force them down that path. The third stage was to strengthen that redirection by the United States of Europe from its own strategic autonomy in the world towards serving the American purposes of world domination by fighting Russia. Over decades, over centuries, there has been deep cultural and economic interconnection, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, between Russia and Europe, particularly Germany, after it was formed in the mid-19th century. And Germany included, greater Germany, Austria, German-speaking people in many parts of Eastern Central Europe, Germany and Russia. And that cooperation was developing and strengthening really from the late 1960s through the 70s, 80s, through Ostpolitik, post-German unification, and a whole lot of deeper cooperation post the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And of course it was symbolised by the Nord Stream pipelines, both Nord Stream 1, built decades ago, and Nord Stream 2, which would take up that cooperation further. And of course, there was also gas pipelines running straight through Ukraine, from which Ukraine earned transfer fees, of course. So the third stage was for the United States to sever Russia and European economic ties and to, increase the strategic, economic and political dependence, military dependence of Europe on the United States, and to refocus them not on trade and cultural ties with their neighbours, Russia, but on serving the purposes of world domination by the United States. And of course, most dramatically, this was symbolised by the sabotage of, Nord Stream 2. Some people have said it was the world's largest environmental terrorist act. The fourth stage in this strategy for world domination was, the Ukraine war itself. Let's go back to Joe Biden's speech shortly after the outbreak of the war, which followed, years and years and years of hostile rhetoric from American political figures towards Russia. Through all the impeachment hearings in Donald Trump, you would hear from Democrats and Republicans the constant refrain that, we fight them over here so we don't have to fight them over there. The constant idea that somehow or other the United States is, existentially committed to fighting Russia in Europe. And if you like, turning Europe and Ukraine into these sort of platforms to fight Russia and to achieve regime change in Russia. So this was the fifth stage. One can see increasingly clearly in retrospect, and it was actually explicitly articulated in Joe Biden's notorious speech in Poland soon after the outbreak of the conflict, that Putin had to go, that the aim of the provocations and the incitements and the refusal of the negotiations was for Russia to make a Afghanistan-style miscalculation in Ukraine, to whack Russia with deep economic sanctions that would, in Joe Biden's word, turn the ruble into rubble and force a political regime change, a social collapse, a regime change in Russia. So that was the stage 4. Now, you might particularly notice that some of these stages are not entirely successful. The eastward expansion of NATO has not been entirely successful. Georgia, Ukraine has not happened, even though they were set on a path of NATO membership in 2008, what's that, 17 years ago. Nor has the Ukraine coup been entirely successful. Yes, they got an anti-Russia group, but they also got a highly corrupt and somewhat politically whiffy group of people with, extreme ethno-nationalists with roots in the ideologies of the 1930s and 1940s that most of the world despise. And of course, nor have the Europe-Russia ties been entirely severed as well, even though Nord Stream was sabotaged. It is potentially capable of being restored, and even in the last couple of days, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has talked about restoring the economic cooperation and use of energy between Russia and Hungary. So, and Hungary, of course, is a significant border state, if you like, on that sort of frontier of Eastern Europe. These first four stages, three in Sergei Glazev's, and he's assumed one which I've just added in, which of course is the eastward expansion of NATO. They are the plan, but and this is consistent with my comments earlier on, that most strategies don't go to plan and are more emergent strategies than, playbooks or things that you can find in a think tank policy paper. They are all failing, and I think the failure of them along the way is an important thing, and an important thing to understand to try to make sense of the chaos of US foreign policy. It's not just an individual phenomenon of Donald Trump right now. It is a feature of the fact that the US is attempting a strategy that is failing, that is ultimately impossible in its goals, because you can't sever the people-to-people cultural and economic links between Europe and Russia, because Russia is the largest country in Europe. Nor can you endlessly weaken collective security in Europe by aggressively pursuing American geostrategic aims in Europe through NATO. So part of the thing is this whole strategy is unraveling in real time, but nonetheless, the pressures on the American government, on the American leaders, are so great. And the fact that they have this such overextended empire means that there are so many people who have enough power to be able to push things along, to demand action in a certain region of the world, to execute plans in certain regions of the world, means that they are constantly sort of being drawn into these broader conflicts. So this is something to bear in mind, particularly as we start to look at the more current and future steps of the plan. So the fourth step in Sergei Glazev's, the fifth step in my 7-step plan of world domination by the US, of course, is regime change in West Asia. This was, in a way, successfully achieved in Syria at dreadful cost to the Syrian people, and with a sense of success at the time, but I guess broader credibility risk for the United States and its European partners, given they are fundamentally supporting a former ISIS terrorist in control of Syria, and there have been some tragic events since then. Similarly, Yemen, they're wanting to defeat the Houthis who've resisted them for a long time, and most importantly, of course, they have pursued the regime change in Iran. Now, all of these events are linked by the idea, I guess, of a greater Israel. And similarly, the whole response to the Gaza genocide has been part of this. The aim has been to back Israel to the hilt, and for Israel, as part of America's networked empire, to control either politically or directly territorially, or the key geostrategic assets, to be dominant in its role in the region, to be the only nuclear power in the region, I guess, apart from Pakistan, to assert the dominance really of the United States via Israel of this key strategic area of West Asia. And again, this is not entirely going to plan. Either the catastrophic diplomatic and reputational damage to the United States for its complicity in the genocide in Gaza is having an impact across Western societies, across the world, across the United Nations. Its disaster in the de facto partition in Syria will come back to bite it. It has been, it has not succeeded despite its, boastful bombings. It has not succeeded in Yemen, nor has it fully succeeded in Iran. It certainly damaged Iran, but it did not achieve the fundamental objective of Operation Rising Lion, which was regime change, regime decapitation, and then regime change with the installation of the Shah's son and all that sort of thing in Iran. So this stage similarly has unravelled to some degree, and a lot of the chaos of the US foreign policy can be read as an improvised response to events not going to plan. The final stage that Sergei Glaziev talks about, of course, is China, and there is, however, one stage that he neglects that I would also insert, and that is regime change in South Asia. It has been a little bit less in your face with Donald Trump, but it was certainly there with Joe Biden's presidency. And I see this not as a Democrat-Republican or a Trump-Biden, Trump as an exception to American general foreign policy trends. I see this as a pretty multi-party sort of approach in America. But there have been significant attempts to engineer regime change in South Asia. There was pretty clear evidence of direct US involvement in the installation of Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh, and concerns expressed by India, I believe, directly to Donald Trump about that. And that also relates to geopolitical rivalries with China and all this sort of thing. There's similar issues, of course, in Pakistan. The United States played a role in deposing Imran Khan, who also wanted to take a different stance on the Ukraine war. And of course, Pakistan has had a complex relationship with both China and the United States over time. But similarly, last year, in 2024, there was significant talk about, Narendra Modi being a threat to Indian democracy, all that kind of thing. Significant efforts by certain overseas international foundations, old, rich, opinionated billionaires, as Dr. S. Jaishankar once said, who sought some sort of regime change in India. And there is absolutely a significant play, I guess, even if it's not a regime change thing, around the strategic issues of South Asia. India is the world's most populous country. It has long resisted for decades and decades and decades and decades US pressure to install United States military bases in India. There are plenty of US bases in the surrounding area, but not in India itself. And that is deeply frustrating, no doubt, for the United States. And I actually think South Asia is much more critically important than many geopolitical analysts tend to consider. So I would add that point into the plan. The US has sought to dominate, often in coded terms about, having a special relationship with India and all that kind of thing. Has sought to dominate India and to get more out of its strategic relationship with India, and hence control one of the other cardinal points of Eurasia. The final stage, of course, is China, and Sergei Glatzev actually refers to a plan of inducing famine in China. If you listen to Steve Bannon talk about, taking down the CCP, you will hear him talk about how China is terrified of its people. It's terrified of losing the mandate of heaven and experiencing the famines that were experienced in 19th century Qing China or at previous times in the dynasty. There's a very limited kind of historical thinking that informs some of these kind of strategies. But there is this desire to force a reversal of the Chinese economic success that would weaken the social stability of China. China is, I guess, a one-party state, and that does impose a certain political fragility around its social system. Objectively, I would think, however strong the strengths of that political system are. So that is the final stage of the strategy to force regime change in China, perhaps to finally allow Taiwan to claim all of China as it has. That tiny little island that's something like 0.2% of China's landmass. It has yet claimed since 1949 to represent all of China. So that is the plan. And again, let's talk about each of those two final steps that are also failing. Things are not going to plan in South Asia. Pakistan's dalliance with terrorism, its dalliance with China is a challenge for the United States. Trump's clumsy diplomacy, Biden's clumsy diplomacy and its economic coerciveness, its strategic coerciveness has seriously alienated elites across the political spectrum in India. And you can see that in, Shashish Tharoor's participation in the sort of world tour, the sort of diplomatic world tour that India is doing around explaining its operations in Operation Sindoor at the moment. And similarly, China, the grand plan, the grand strategy on China is also failing. Do you remember April the 2nd? It was going to be on April Fool's Day, but, the fools in charge of the White House decided to change that. Liberation Day in the United States and the absurd tariffs on the whole world, including the penguins of McDonald and Heard Island, primarily directed at China, primarily directed at a sort of coercive, break of the rest of the world from China. It fell flat on Donald Trump's face. Exactly how all of that will play out, I'm not entirely sure, but it's certainly not playing out at the moment. There's a person in the Elbridge Colby who talks about strategic sequencing for geostrategy in the United States, and many people in America talk about, well, we can't fight a free front war or all that sort of thing. The reality is circumstances, failed plans, ill-conceived strategies mean that the United States is fighting wars on all those fronts and is its grand strategy planned out to sort of take out this country and then move on to that country is absolutely collapsing. It wasn't able to take out Russia. It wasn't able totally to sabotage European strategic autonomy, because there are some residual elites there who, may cloak behind some flattery of Donald Trump plans to actually restore their strategic autonomy. They weren't able to take out Iran. They weren't able to take out India's neutrality and independence. And they utterly, catastrophically failed in their sort of economic war, which was also a social and political war against China. It was a war that was aiming really to collapse the economy, collapse the society, force a change in regime, and then have America swoop in and loot the resources of China. This is the insane American Raj plan for world domination. It is demonstrably unable to be implemented. It is a mad plan, but there is just too many people in the United States who have the resources, the capability, given the airtime to sort of, pursue these kind of strategies. When you have 800 military bases around the world, when you have emigre communities around the world, when you have trusts and private foundations that indulge these strategies all around the world, then what you do is you don't develop a coherent, sensible foreign policy that's adapted to the needs of your people and your role in the world. What you do is you empower the madness of attempting to dominate the world. And that is the madness of the American Raj right now. It is demonstrably failing, but I don't think quite the United States elites have really felt the cost of that failure. And until they do, I guess the world will have to find a way to push back against these plans, always at the risk that in places like Syria or others, that persistent arrogance and violence and domineering supremacist ideology of the United States elites will lead to catastrophic events like what happened in Syria, indeed what's happened in Gaza, and indeed what has happened in Iran or Ukraine. So that's my summary of, I guess, where we are with the US world strategy. Yes, the US does have a grand strategy for world domination. No, it's not written down in think tanks or policy papers. It emerges from the chaos of old ideas, old instincts, interests, interest groups pushing for things, and the momentum of this ridiculously overexpanded empire with its tentacles all around the world, and its resourcing of people with these schemes to control the world or control the part of the world originally they were from. So when you see the madness of Donald Trump, remember it's not just Donald Trump. It is the madness of the American Raj. And with patience, with resilience, and with resistance, we can ultimately, as a world, get beyond the American Raj. The British Raj fell in the 1940s. There were very few people outside of Britain who were sad to see that go. I suspect the world will feel much the same about the end of the American Raj, hopefully in the near future. Thanks for watching.